Desire is a contract with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want. Start your day with study and reflection. Oh, Danny boy. Oh, Danny boy. Oh, Danny boy. Chumbawamba. Back again. All right, today's reflection is on something that people have asked for. So a few-minute summary, not just to the philosophy of Vedanta, which the intro episode to this podcast, episode number 1, gives a great 15-minute overview of the entirety of the philosophy of Vedanta. But people have asked, what are the main takeaways, the main keys for someone hearing about this philosophy for the first time, or maybe some of us have come across it a handful of times, but you want to understand the keys, the key principles behind this philosophy. So figured we'd spend an episode on those keys. After all, another word for Vedanta is Sanatana Dharma, which means eternal principles. Out of the list of eternal principles, you could read the Gita, for example, and read through dozens of eternal principles. But the key principles to Vedanta, according to James, and taken from nearly a decade of study each day and a few cycles. I'm on my 4th cycle of the 3-year course that I study each morning with Vedanta Academy in India, that anyone listening can also study each morning from the comfort of your couch. I highly recommend visiting the ashram, but you don't need to go visit in person. It is just crazy cool that you can download the app. Vedanta World is the app. Download the app. Link is in the description, and you can tune in to the same lectures that I'm listening to every morning. It's a 3-year course, and it's such a foundation for not just your day, but your entire life. That ramble aside, this is supported by a whole lot of the literature, scriptures within the Vedantic philosophy. But the selection of these even themes, key virtue, key value, key practice, that's just James, the speaker, choosing this structure, these categories. But let's start with the key virtue within the Vedantic philosophy, and that is discernment. One of the greatest sages within Vedanta, Shankaracharya, or Shankara, which is another word for Shiva, the destroyer. So destroyer of ignorance is what this sage is known for. And one of his most famous scriptural texts, Vivekachudamani, it is all about discernment. Discernment, discretion, these words can be interchangeably used. But even the title of the text is the crown jewel of discernment. So the jewel at the top of the crown is discernment from the real and the unreal, from the permanent and the impermanent. That discernment is the key virtue. If you have absolute discernment from the real and unreal, you have realization. That is realization, not only realizing it in some revelatory sense, but also the other sense, to realize it, bring it about, bring it forth. To realize reality, to not just see it, but bring it forth. And that requires discernment. The key value, a value to hone, to appreciate more and more each day, to achieve that virtue of discernment, that ability to discern, that is the key value to appreciate more and more and more and more each day, is self-sufficiency. Cultivating a sufficiency within yourself. We all know the friend that's insanely needy, that can rarely ever provide anything to the group and is just the person in the group that is so needy for help, for attention. And that needy friend, think of that as the neediest person you know, and think of the opposite. Someone that is so self-sufficient, you can go to them with any problem. Think of the absolute most self-sufficient person that does not bother the universe whatsoever, that is so competent in anything that they set out to do, is so strong, that is a wellspring of resources for you because they're just overflowing, an abundance of them, a wellspring of wisdom, a wellspring of strength. And this is such an interesting concept that I'd never really heard in the West, something to value, self-sufficiency. That it's almost like in a dualistic worldview, a view separate from everything you need to exist. You're second to everything that you need, right? But in a non-dual view, where you are everything you need, you are everything that is, and it is a discovery, continual discovery to that realization. In a non-dual philosophy, whether it's non-dual Christianity or Judaism or Islam or something like Vedanta, and they all are so similar by definition. If it's non-dual, it's not going to be too dissimilar than other non-dual traditions. But in a non-dual philosophy, it opens the door to a whole world to discover around self-sufficiency and the value that we could place on such a quality. It is incomparable. And the value that one could place on this principle of self-sufficiency is essentially infinite in the realm of a non-dual philosophy. But I'm going to read directly from Vedanta Treatise, Swami's magnum opus, the end-to-end compendium on the entirety of the philosophy of Vedanta that anyone can read, and there is not a single word that's out of place with this text. And I'm going to read the description of this characteristic directly from Vedanta Treatise, the magnum opus from Swami Parthasarathi, also the end-to-end compendium of the entirety of the philosophy of Vedanta, without a single word out of place. It is such a beautiful text. But I'll read the self-sufficiency description. As a person evolves spiritually, he develops self-sufficiency, becomes independent of the world around him. He stands out a master of all he encounters in the world, whereas a spiritually retarded person remains a slave of his body and its perceptions, his mind and its emotions, intellect and its thoughts. A self-developed person revels within his own self. His peace and happiness is not dependent upon anything other than his self. He does not crave for sense objects or emotions, thoughts, or ideas. He or she remains ever free, unaffected by the manifold pairs of opposites that constitute the world, be it pleasure or pain, joy or sorrow, honor or dishonor. Only human beings have the spiritual potential to enjoy such independence. All other creatures are entirely dependent upon the world for their peace and pleasure. You gain self-sufficiency by focusing your attention on the self. The more you attune to the self and the less dependent you are on the objects and beings of the world, and by finding your union with the self within, you gain absolute peace and bliss. Nothing in the world can augment that supreme state of fulfillment. You become totally self-sufficient, truly spiritual. You may wonder, how can anyone remain unaffected by the world, become free from the persecutions of the body, mind, and intellect, keep a balanced mind amidst trials and tribulations? The answer lies in spiritual discipline. Through spiritual discipline, you gradually detach yourself from the material equipments and their activities by attaching to the self within, until you become established in the self. Thereafter, the world cannot disturb you. Take the example of a coconut. When a coconut is raw, the kernel sticks to the hard shell. When the bondage is firm, you break the shell, the kernel also breaks. But not so when the coconut dries up. When a coconut is completely dry, the kernel separates clear from the shell, becomes free. It shakes inside like a rattle. Now, when the shell of the dry coconut is broken, the kernel does not break. It remains as it is, unhurt, unaffected. The same is true of yourself. As long as you are attached to your body, mind, intellect, you are affected when they are affected. But when you detach yourself from them, you remain equanimous, regardless of any affliction they go through. You gain your independence, liberation. I will say the next principle that he goes through, next characteristic of a spiritually developed person that he goes through in the book, is universal love. So I want to make sure that there's no misinterpretation that self-sufficiency is a retraction from the world. Like Christ said, firmly in the world, but not of it. The friend that is so self-sufficient that they aren't running around trying to get more. They're there for anything you ask. The opposite of the needy friend. Just taken to the cosmic polar opposite of that. So the two remaining keys within this philosophy, the key enemy and the key daily practice. The key enemy is attachment, desire. The two enemies, as mentioned in the Gita, are our likes and our dislikes, our preferences. Raga dvesha is the Sanskrit term for our likes and our dislikes, the two enemies, but what do they orient towards? And that is our attachments, our preferences at large. Like the Buddha's first two noble truths, life is suffering, or always dissatisfactory, is another translation, and the suffering or that continual dissatisfaction is caused by desire. As we've said multiple times in this podcast, desire is a contract with yourself to be unhappy until you get what you want. You feel mental stress, it's because you have that stress is from the mental agitation of an unfulfilled desire. Our stress, strain, suffering comes from our attachments, many of which are always outside of our reach. A simple one is being attached to our external circumstance. The world is change. It is impossible to hold it all still. Or attached to an idea that if I get that, then I'll be happy. Or as Schopenhauer famously said, happiness is difficult to find within oneself, but impossible to find it anywhere else. That attachment to these thinking, that satisfaction, peace is out there when it can only be in here. That is the root of the vast majority of all of our suffering. So what is the key practice, key daily practice? To dehypnotize ourselves from these attachments, these illusions. The key daily practice is before the sun comes up. 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. Watch a lecture on the Vedanta World app. Reflect on something that you heard the day before. Read through St. Augustine. But study and reflect daily. Not every few days, but every day. And do it ideally before the sun comes up, before the world pulls you out of yourself, before you're busy with your inbox, before you're busy with your task list. Start your day with study and reflection. So those are the 4 keys to the philosophy of Vedanta. The key virtue, the key value or characteristic of a self-developed person, the key enemy, and the key practice. We will see you next time on the Daily Vedantic.